Welcome. It is time for Constitution Study Television. I am your host, Douglas V. Gibbs. DouglasVGibbs.com, politicalpistachio.com, or you can send me an email at constitutionspeaker@yahoo.com. And I want to talk about constitutional scholars. Some people try to call me a constitutional scholar. I've never felt that way. I don't necessarily like that term. My friend Tim Curlin, who some of you knew online as Loki, he was my mentor. He was more scholarly than I am, in my opinion, regarding the U.S. Constitution. But even he didn't appreciate constitutional scholar. Experts, we know our stuff. We're constitutionalists, whatever you want to say. All right. Now, that all said, one time years ago, as a matter of fact, Loki was still around. This was before he passed away. And he was listening when I was on my old radio station, 1050 AM in the Inland Empire here in Southern California out of San Bernardino. And I had Dr. Larry Arnn from Hillsdale College, the president of Hillsdale College, in my radio program. And we spent the hour arguing. We disagreed on three issues. The constitutional scholar believed in judicial review, implied powers, and felt that the states did not have the power of nullification. At one point when we were talking about judicial review, I stated, well, when it comes to judicial review, what you're saying is that the courts, which is a part of the federal government, can decide what the authorities of the federal government are. So isn't that the federal government deciding for itself what its own authorities are? How is that limited government? Today, I was introduced to another constitutional scholar. Not personally, I saw him on television. He was on the Mark Levin program, Life, Liberty, and Levin, which airs one episode on Sundays on Fox News, and then he has a daily thing on CRTV, or I think now it's Blaze TV. But anyway, and I really like Mark Levin. I respect him more than most of the voices out there when it comes to constitutionality. He gets it more. I was kind of depressed, dissatisfied, bothered by the fact that he didn't challenge this constitutional scholar a number of times. This constitutional scholar, the name was Michael McConnell. He's a professor at Stanford University, former 10th Circuit Court judge, so on and so forth. And the program aired on Fox News on June 23rd, 2019, for those of you watching this later. And when, for example, separation of church and state came up and Mark Levin tried to steer it in the right direction, and the guy basically said, well, yeah, we don't want government telling us what prayer we are allowed to say in school because government doesn't do that very well. I'm like, where is he? What's he talking about? He was supporting the idea of separation of church and state, sort of, and sort of not. He was kind of trying to sound scholarly and in what the mainstream conventional wisdom of the Constitution is today, while still trying to sound a little bit conservative. And he never mentioned, for example, the letter to the Danbury Baptists by Thomas Jefferson, which is where the term separation of church and state came from, and what was originally and what was actually meant by that, and so on and so forth. So I was kind of disappointed. I expected Mark Levin to kind of call him on it, and he did, and he just kept questioning him. How to respect, I don't know. Then the Mr. McConnell, Professor McConnell, says that the only federal authority over immigration is naturalization. He's referring to the reference to that in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4. And then he said that immigration for the first 100 years was a state issue. Then after that, it really became more of a federal issue. But, and so it's really a state issue too. And how that all got brought up was Mark Levin was asking about sanctuary state and 10th Amendment and things like that. And Professor McConnell was basically saying that the states had a right to be a sanctuary state because of states' rights. And, the Democrats have suddenly discovered states' rights again in the Constitution, when they usually don't. And I'm like, wait a second. They haven't discovered states' rights. This is a different kind of issue. This isn't a states' rights issue. Immigration is a concurrent issue on some parts of it, but when it comes to the authority over legislation, prohibiting persons from coming across the border, so on and so forth, that's a totally federal issue. And when he said that immigration, the only mention of immigration was the naturalization clause in Article 1, Section 8, really? So Article 1, Section 9 does not exist? Article 1, Section 9, the very first clause, which gives Congress the authority to outlaw the Atlantic slave trade after 1808, also gives them the authority to prohibit anybody from migrating in the United States that they deem fit to prohibit as of 1808 as well. So in other words, immigration law, the right to write legislation prohibiting persons from coming to this country, was given to Congress as a sole authority in 1808 by the Constitution. It was written in 1787, but the clause says, 1808, that Congress shall not be Congress shall not, I can't remember the exact words off the top of my head, but the Congress is going to be able to, as of 1808, do that. And they did. It was a state issue before that. In that sense, constitutional scholar McConnell was essentially correct. But here's my point. Here's what I'm getting at. When someone says they're a constitutional scholar or they're called a constitutional scholar, what they're really talking about is constitutional law. And when they're talking about constitutional law, they're not talking the black letter of the law as much as they are judicial opinion of the law or of the Constitution. And this is where constitutional scholars and I part ways, because I'm not about what the constitutional law precedent, other cases. That's not the U.S. Constitution. That's opinion about what's constitutional. The judges, when it comes to the law and the Constitution, they can only issue opinion. The final arbiters of the Constitution is we the people and the states. And it is not the job of the judges to dictate what or interpret what the Constitution. And it's funny because when I talk about interpretation, I talk about two people in my head who speak different languages, and there's an interpreter in between. And so one says in one language something to one, and they tell them, and they back and forth. And one recipient may say, okay, the interpreter told me this, but it doesn't match the look on the face of the person. But hey, what can I do about it? I got to believe the interpreter. The person with the true power there is the interpreter. I have to, as the person who doesn't know the language of the other person I'm talking to, trust the interpreter and trust that they are honest and that they are on the up and up with me. But how am I going to know if they're not? Same thing with the judges. When we let the judges interpret the law or interpret the Constitution, we've given them the ultimate power. They can say whatever they want. Who we'd argue? We don't know the language, or so that's the assumption. Therefore, the judges have the ultimate power. And that's what has happened over more than 200 years. Really, it was going on even before the Revolutionary War, but it really got solidified when it came to legal documentation and precedent with Marbury versus Madison in 1803, when John Marshall basically declared that the courts are the final arbiters of the Constitution. And it's their job to be the final arbiters, and they're the final say, and so on and so forth. So, constitutional scholars, appreciate you, but I don't trust you, because you're interpreting the Constitution. You're doing so based on a mainstream conventional wisdom, what we've been taught for the last couple hundred years kind of stuff, and it's an interpretation that's not in line with the original intent. My understanding of the Constitution is not based on what some judge said or what some constitutional scholar said. I'm not going to run out and go get Michael McConnell's books, if he has any, or journals, and everything else, because he's a constitutional scholar, so he must be right. Because he wasn't there. The people who were there were the framers of the Constitution. The people who were there were those who attended the ratification conventions of the U.S. Constitution. The people who were there were the people who were questioning it, like the federal farmer, with his letters to the editor that posed really good questions that we have today. Those are the people who are there, so I'm going to take it from them. I've read what they had to say. I've read what they told me. And then when it comes to the other amendments, like, say, the 14th Amendment, then I have read the Congressional Globe. That's a congressional record when they debated that particular amendment. I'm going to go back to the original sources. I'm going to go back to who said what, not the interpretation offered to me by a quote-unquote constitutional scholar who's basing his opinion on some judge's opinion, who based his opinion on some textbook or some other judge's opinion, or on John Marshall's interpretation. Ultimately, what I'm getting at is when it comes to constitutional scholars, just because those terms are in front of their names doesn't necessarily mean they're constitutional at all. Sort of like when Barack Obama was called a constitutional professor and lecturer, which he did, by the way, lecture on the Constitution at the University of Chicago. But what he lectured on was how to use the 14th Amendment to create racial division. So be careful who you believe to be a quote-unquote constitutional scholar. Search for yourself. Even me, what I've got to say. Question it if you're not sure. Look up some resources. Ask the questions. Leave a comment questioning me. I've got a couple people, even tried to correct my exact. There was one gentleman who I respect greatly because he used to work with Loki as well, who, gave me some information about Andrew Johnson, and why he was impeached. And ultimately, while the excuse that this person used was accurate, that's the excuse they used, ultimately they tried to impeach him, or they did impeach him actually, because he disagreed with him. Ultimately, that was the reason. Whatever excuse they used, beside the point. But anyway, without getting into semantics and all that, my point is this. Just because someone says they're a constitutional scholar, that doesn't mean they are. Go with the original intent, not someone who's judging the Constitution based on precedent or case law. I really don't care what the judges have had to say. Every once in a while they get it right. Usually they get it wrong. Ultimately, though, in the end, that's not their place. Black letter of the law. Constitution is a social contract. And when it comes to the authorities of the United States, it's sort of like giving the federal government a power of attorney. They have a power of attorney over the authorities expressly granted in the Constitution. But that doesn't mean they can go off and do other things that might be related to that power of attorney. If the power of attorney says that they have the authority over naturalization and writing legislation to prohibit persons from coming to the country, then that means their authority is uniform laws regarding naturalization and prohibiting persons from coming to the country. There is no other interpretation. Black letter of the law. That's what the power of attorney says. All right, so that's that. Thank you for watching. DouglasVGibbs.com, politicalpistachio.com. I got books out there. I would love to see you buy them. Also at youtube.com/DouglasVGibbs, I'm getting ready to start a web series called Real History. Once I get that thing rolling, I'll let you know. Also visit the page every once in a while. I'll have new episodes of that as well. We're going to go through my book, A Promise of American Liberty. My latest, the 7th book of my writing career so far. The big, thick, 525-page one. So we're going to go through that book, and I'm going to really lay it down for you by video, web series, on the other YouTube page of mine. So be sure to subscribe to that one and this one. And don't forget to hit the notifications bell so that you get, email notifications that my new video is out. Until then, united we stand, combined we kick butt. Stay safe, stay patriotic, and as always, stay constitutional. We'll see you next time. Thanks.